Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz. It's Tuesday evening, and I'm going to try and sneak under the wire with a tag for Tag Tuesday, because I was tagged this morning by Alan of Big Hard Books and Classics and a lovely new tag by Mark of Booktime with Elvis. And the tag is called What Makes a Classic tag. And Mark is inviting us to have a think about that age-old question of how does a book justify the label a classic? And then also he's done us a bunch of prompts to give examples of classics and why. I'm going to give my opinion, which is that there's two elements for me to what makes a classic, and one relates to time and one relates to quality. And I'll go with time first because that's the easier one in a way, because I think a classic is a book that has stood the test of time, or it's a book that we still want to read today, even though it was written in the past. Now, obviously, a book that was written yesterday is in the past. So, but that it's not a book for one time. It's a book for generations, subsequent generations. It's still got things about it that are relevant or engaging or bring us joy. Yes, reading pleasure and interest. So it's not just an old book. That's the point, because you might read an old book for sort of historical research or, sort of antiquarian reasons. But this has got to be a book that, to be a classic, I think it has to be a book that you still want to read as a book for itself. How old does it have to be? How much time has to pass for us to say it's a book for sort of all time rather than one time? I would say at least 50 years. I actually tend to think of pre-1950 publications as publication as being that's sort of like anything before 1950 I think of as a classic. You might say it's going to be 100 years old or pre the 20th century. Doesn't really matter. Another thing I would say is that I've talked about time, but a true classic should also transcend boundaries of kind of geography and culture as well. So it's not just that people still want to read it, but that people from different places still want to read it. Which brings me to the second element, and this is the more subjective and slightly trickier one, and that is the issue of some kind of quality. And I don't mean that it necessarily has to be sort of high literary whatever. A lot of classics, they've kept being read because it's more, I don't know, that they've got something about them that is exceptional or that speaks to us, something, but it can't just be an old book. That's the point. Not every book that's 50 years old is a classic. It's got to have that extra something to be inspired or creatively interesting, or have something about its style, or it can be exceptional example in a particular genre, I think, to be a classic. I mean, let's think of Lord of the Rings. Now, don't tell the big Lord of the Rings fan, but it's not really a brilliantly written series that, brilliant ideas, but not the writing qualities. No, nothing special. But it defines the idea of a fantasy novel. So that's how I define a classic. But how do you, say in the comments or make a version of this video and give me your version, because there's no one answer, I think, to that question. So let's do Mark's actual prompts. So prompt number 1 is, okay, a classic, the one with a gripping plot and universal themes. And for that, I'm going back to, about 2,500 years to ancient classical Greek drama. I think I will specifically pick Oedipus by Sophocles. But to be honest, I could have picked something by Aeschylus or Euripides. The point is that Greek drama, it may, there's things about it that are quite alien to us, but it absolutely has gripping stories and identifiable, characters to identify with or be shocked by, or, and definitely universal themes. I mean, you have to bear in mind they were written for competition, so, the audience would have walked out if they were boring. But in terms of universal themes, you get family conflict, you get aftermath of war, relations between sexes, attitudes to authority. So many universal themes, and that's why they're still worth reading. Prompt number 2, the subversive one. Now, I had 2 possible answers for this, and I'm going to quickly tell you both of them because my first thought, was this one, Boccaccio, the Decameron, because I thought, what is more subversive than living through the Black Death in Florence in 1348 and following it up by writing a book that is about the most outrageous tales, the most outrageous stories, adventures, love, sex, great daft characters. Yeah. Subversive in one way, but actually more subversive in a different way, I think, is Milton's Paradise Lost. Why do I say that? Because he's rewriting the sort of biblical Adam and Eve story, and creation and so on in the Bible, and almost perhaps intentionally or unintentionally, I don't know, he ends up making Satan, Lucifer, the most charismatic character in the story, and I think he leaves any reader really questioning God's role in all this, and is it fair and is it right what God does and how he manipulates, people? Yeah, well, you have to read it to find out. There we go. Prompt number 3, the one that defines a time and a place. Okay, I have gone for Homer, Iliad and the Odyssey. Here's an old copy of the Odyssey just to wave at you. But because I think, if you ask people to think of ancient Greece, what comes into your mind has very much been defined by the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is funny really because they were actually written before the sort of classical period in Greece and about a time even further back, and that's because they draw on an oral tradition. And I think you could think of a large number probably of other classics that kind of grow out of oral traditions and define a time and a place or a culture, or books that say, well, who are we, and where do we come from, and what do we believe in? Icelandic sagas would be an example. Ramayana, almost like every culture that's got an oral tradition that's now been recorded has its equivalent that will define a time and a place. Prompt number 4, the complex, groundbreaking one. Dante. Dante's Divine Comedy. Yes, it's complex, but absolutely groundbreaking. It's that sort of telling a long story in poetry. It's groundbreaking in the way he creates a sort of like a world view that's almost like the world building you'd get in a fantasy novel today, and his characters are groundbreaking to me because they are so real. He's writing real people, whether that's sort of in creating a sort of real Virgil as one of the characters, but it also using sort of real historical figures in the story, and with real characters. And in doing this, writing it in his dialect of Italian of the time, sort of the medieval Tuscan dialect, he ends up kind of, in effect, standardising, which people didn't write serious books in in Italian before that, and he sort of standardises written Italian almost by doing so. Yeah, and it's a great story and well worth reading. Number 5. The one with archetypal characters. Now, I debated a few in my head for this one, but I went for Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I've forgotten to bring it here to wave at you, but, I'm reading it at the moment and having a wonderful time. And archetypal characters. Now, the Canterbury Tales has a series of tellers, people who are telling the tales who are all characters in themselves, and then you've got the characters in the stories. And in both parts, you get archetypal characters. If you write a assertive, sassy older woman who's really confident about her own sort of sexuality and enjoyment of sex, you're drawing on the archetype of the wife of Bath, kind of almost whether you know it or not. Other archetypal characters he has the dodgy snake oil salesman, that's the pardoner, the hypocritical religious figure, the friar and the monk, in fact, the slightly the aggressive sort of businessman, the miller, the so many, the innocent, the squire, the noble figure, the knight. It's one after another, they're in there, and they're in the tales too. So for example, the archetype of the rich older man who decides he's going to take a younger wife and then gets his comeuppance as a result. I could go on and on. Next prompt, 6, the one that's a complete one-off. And now again, I debated about this, but I went for Don Quixote by Cervantes. And why do I say that? Because as I was reading that, and I think it's the same for most people reading Don Quixote, you find yourself thinking, what on earth am I reading here? What is going on? Why? What's real? What's meant to be fantasy? Completely, yes, absolutely one of a kind. And yet, it's very often described as the first modern novel. And so many other classics written since draw on it, even though it was one of a kind. If you've read Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne, so, written, how much later, well, if Cervantes was writing at the beginning of the 17th century, and Tristram Shandy is the mid-18th century, about 150 years later, and yet totally drawing on Don Quixote all the way through. But then if you read the Posthumous Memoirs of Cubas, Brazilian classic from the 19th century by Machado de Assis, real favourite book of mine, absolutely drawing on both Don Quixote and Tristram Shandy. The classics do that. They speak to each other over time. Or let's have a modern classic. Okay, this one's from Paraguay. Either Supreme by Augusto Roa Bastos. You can really, published in 1974, so just about to scrape into my definition of a classic. Really, you can see Don Quixote and in this. There you go. Prompt number 7, the one we quote from all the time. Okay, only one possible answer for me to this has to be Shakespeare. I've picked Hamlet. It could have been, any number of Shakespeare's plays. Have you ever had that experience of going to see a Shakespeare play like Lear or Hamlet or Macbeth or whatever? And it can seem like bits can seem like a load of old quotations strung together, and you wonder, you're impressed by the way the actors manage to deliver them in ways that feel fresh because they're so familiar. Why is Shakespeare, probably one of the most quoted writers in the English language? Why, even though he was writing in, end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, is he still quoted so much? Because, and this is, what defines classic, isn't it? That, it doesn't matter that they're old. The people he's writing about and their feelings and the scrapes they get into or the bad decisions they make are ones that we still recognise, just like we still recognise, people in the Odyssey or people in Greek tragedies or that's it, isn't it? That's why it's worth still reading classics. People haven't changed. Human beings haven't changed. Circumstances and context changes, but human beings haven't. Yeah. And finally, the rediscovered classic, the last prompt. Okay, I've picked for this one that has been rediscovered in a very literal sense and actually is still being rebuilt, and that's the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, that was those stories go back to ancient Mesopotamia, possibly the Sumerians. So thousands and thousands of years. First written down around or possibly 3,500 years ago. But when I say written down, we're talking cuneiform on clay tablets, it lost for centuries. And then 19th century archaeologists started digging up these clay tablets and starting to translate them and thinking, hey, there's a story here, and so the story of or different versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh are gradually been re-emerging, and meets my criteria for classic because it's got a good plot, good characters, that still speak to us. It's got the original bromance in it, but you're going to have to get a version. If you want to read, you're going to have to get a version where someone sort of pieced it back together enough to make it readable. But they're out there and well worth reading. As a little curiosity to end on, The Guardian had an article about a week ago, and I'll link to it below, about that we may yet get to recreate an even older sort of epic story than that of Gilgamesh. There's a character, a goddess that appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the goddess Inanna, or later became known as Ishtar, and then sort of morphed, influenced the Aphrodite, Venus sort of figure. And as more cuneiform tablets are found and translated, there is some hope that we might yet get the full story of Inanna, and you have yet another rediscovered epic classic to enjoy. Now, who am I going to tag? I would say, if you've got things to say about classics, please do this tag, but I will specifically tag the booktubers who met up in London last Saturday, and you know who you are. And because we all, swapped channels and made sure we were aware of each other, I'm hoping you'll see this. And any of you that likes reading classics and fancies a go at this, do it.